I don't even know what YouTube is going to do as soon as I say the title of this particular book. After all, it's exactly what happens in that story. There Once Lived a Woman Who Tried to Kill Her Neighbor's Baby is a compilation of short stories by Ludmila Petrushevskaya. The English edition labels them as scary fairy tales, which is fair enough, some of them are, but others are just simply mystical stories, and others are not mystical at all, but you should not read any of them to children. This is my cheat sheet of these stories to keep track of them, spoilers here, but if you look through them you'll see that there is some really fucked up shit in there, and the English edition doesn't even include the worst ones, where the husbands do actually kill their wives in jealous rage, so count yourselves lucky, I guess. The English edition, ever so helpfully, separates the stories into Songs of the Eastern Slavs, which I think was the original title for the compilation, allegories, requiems, and fairy tales, even though my Russian edition does not do that, despite the English intro claiming otherwise. I would say that the separation is somewhat arbitrary. It also changes the order of some of the stories, which is not ideal. I can't even give you a pitch here or a sample of these stories, they're quite different. So let's just simply talk about the book, and I will give you relevant plot points as we go. How about that? I'm gonna say, when I first started the book and I read the first few stories, I was confused. I normally go blind into these contemporary books. I maybe read this little blurb at the back of the book, but not much more, and so I was not sure what I was getting myself into. The first few stories in this compilation read straight as those scary stories that children tell each other over the campfire, or during a sleepover, or in our case, in a pioneer camp. And I was like, okay, let's see, I've never seen such stories written down as a book before. This was the folklore of the 20th century, these scary stories for the children to tell each other over the campfire, and urban legends for the teens and adults, since they also tend to go into the scary/gruesome side, but part of the oral tradition nevertheless. But as I read these stories, it was weird. The vibe was slightly off, as the whole execution and the tone of them was very reminiscent of the children's scary stories, but the topics were really adult. It made for an odd combo. The lost soldiers of World War II, the orphaned children, the neighbors of the communal apartments trying to kill each other, heavy stuff, but it tried to scare me in a very juvenile way, like it was the dead guy all along. Ooh. I was a scaredy cat when I was a child. Well, who am I kidding? I still am. But this does not scare me, so it wasn't hitting. There was this novelty aspect to it, but it wasn't enough to get me hooked. But then the stories changed. The tone remained somewhat otherworldly, but the stories became more grounded. At least some of them did, and that's the ones that I liked the most. The two most hard-hitting ones, Hygiene and the New Robinson Crusoes, have no mystical elements to them whatsoever, and yet they are the most horrifying. One of a family stuck in quarantine and they all die one after the other, reads very weirdly after COVID, and the other of a family trying to survive in a village, a stark allegory for the countrywide hunger. Both stories, but especially the second one, are terrifying because they are real. It's actually interesting to juxtapose these two stories, as one is all about the family turning on each other and sacrificing family members, while the other one is all about survival. They actually acquire more people as they go, but they don't leave anybody behind. And it's quite interesting to read them as such, as these two facets of the human existence. It's quite well known that humans are capable of essentially anything, both great kindness and great monstrosities alike, and these two stories demonstrate that. And that's probably why I like the New Robinson Crusoes more. The threat that they face is not supernatural at all, but still a force way beyond their control, and still they persevere, while in Hygiene they more or less give up. But these two stories are probably the outliers. Most of the other ones have some magical or mystical elements to them, or a twist in the end where what's been described in the story has not been real in the first place. However, the stories do not feel homogeneous in tone or genre, and I don't think they necessarily need to be, but it makes for an interesting reading experience. story, Nina Komarova, not included in the English edition, about a little girl who gets lost in the woods and gets reunited with her family years later, does not have any magical elements to it beyond simple luck or coincidence, and it is nestled between The Cabbage Patch Mother and Marilene's Secret, arguably the two most fairy tale-esque stories in the whole compilation. So the tone constantly shifts between what's real and what is not. So maybe it is easier to read the book story by story when you have like 10-15 minutes to spare to read a story. Or just embrace the oddities and be ready for whatever the author throws at you. What's been pointed out is that Petrushevskaya has a certain style to the way that she tells her fairy tale-esque stories. She essentially tells them as if we're reading a magical realism story, and then she might provide the keys to understanding it at the end. Sometimes it's like a proper real-world explanation as to what's been going on, and sometimes you just need to accept that it was magic. But if you read enough of these stories, you should be able to recognize the signs as to when reality is actually real and when it is a proxy, a dream, or an image. And it's easier in some than in the others. Like in Two Kingdoms, you should be able to guess what's going on pretty quickly. While in something like The Black Coat, I'm not even sure why this particular imagery has been chosen for the subject matter. And Petrushevskaya does deal with heavy subjects, so trigger warnings do apply. Suicide, death, murder, child murder, rape, hunger, miscarriage, all of it. And it all exists in this real world that is not particularly real because it borders that fairy tale world, so it does make for powerful allegories. However, it's rather difficult for me to say if she's trying to add morals here. And I only bring this up because fairy tales as a genre do tend to have morals, sometimes simple, sometimes more complex ones. Here, though, the miracle, for example, is very clear in its messaging, where a mother comes to a miracle worker asking for a miracle for her no-good son, and it's all about be careful what you wish for, monkey's paw type of situation. But then there is something like The Cabbage Patch Mother, which is about miscarriage, I think, about a woman who finds a girl the size of a pea in a cabbage patch and starts calling her daughter. So is it about working through trauma then? Like it is in There Is Someone in the House, where it is about letting go of your baggage and your past. In there, a woman thinks that there's someone in the house who's trying to hurt her, so she throws all of her stuff out of the window. I tend to think that I have a decent level of media literacy, but I found myself at a loss here a couple of times. It's made worse by the stories that are so far out there that they feel like a bad trip. Marilene's Secret comes to mind, where two girls are cursed by a wizard and they become one huge girl who then is forced to become a circus freak to survive, and that's simply the hook. It gets weirder. Honestly, if you're into weird stories, there are quite a few in here for you. There is one thing that bothers me here, and I think I should voice it. These stories are often labeled as scary stories, or even worse, as horror in all of the places where the book is available. And I've seen comments and reviews call them scary and terrifying, but they're not. At best, they're chilling, they're creepy, they're disconcerting, they have this certain sense of unease about them, but not true terror or horror. If you're truly into horror, there's nothing for you here, I promise you. And I do think that it's worthy of bringing up here, and not just simply from the setting expectations point of view, but also because I think that these stories are unique even without them being horror. They have this slightly whimsical tone to them. They try to scare you in a very straightforward way, but they also deal with this heavy subject and they try to work through trauma. These stories take you by the hand and lead you through these worlds of the talking dead and miraculous recoveries, of people's kindness and betrayals, of two dancing girls in a body of a circus freak, but also orphan children and widowers. And all of it's set against the very real backdrop of the real world and the consequences of World War II, of hunger, of death, of people battling their demons. These fairy tales are hiding stuff from you in plain sight. They want you to see beyond the fairy tale, beyond the mysticism, beyond the mystery. There is one key that helped me to understand these stories, and that's Petrushevskaya herself.
В одном из интервью вы сказали, что вам 9 лет. Это правда?
А что, не видно?
She's a magnificent woman. I've watched a fairly recent interview with her, and she is eccentric in the most wholesome way. There are very few women like her.
А мне нравится быть... Я прирожденная шляпница. Шляпы носили только интеллигенты. Такие интеллигенты паршивые. Ну, раньше за это просто расстреливали. А сейчас хотя бы просто смеются. Да и хрен с этим. Для меня шляпа как-то униформа.
She went through so much in her life. She was born in 1938. She went through World War II. Her mother had to send her to an orphanage just so the girl could eat because there was hunger in the country. She had to beg on the streets. And then she lived another 40 years in the bloody Soviet Union where she could never get published. But you look at her now at 80 plus and she has so much whimsy, so much joy for life, so much compassion, but also this core made of steel. She has that aura about her, about will to live, to learn new things and never give up. When you look at her, and if you get her, the stories, they also fall into place. I normally don't read stories like this, and I probably never will, but for her, to get to know her even a little bit, it was worth it. This is about as eccentric as I get. I wanted to pay homage to her. Try these stories out for yourself. Maybe they will capture you, or at least give you that little thrill, just like those scary stories did over the campfire. I think we could all use a little bit of that, while also remembering the true reality of our lives. You know what I'm doing now? My nails, they don't fit this ensemble, so I'm just gonna cover them with something darker, and we'll see about that. Also, I wanted to wear these. I think they fit the ensemble that I'm going for, but they're not prescription, so it's not gonna work. Oh my goodness gracious.